Great, thank you, and thanks everyone. It's a nice turnout for being a late talk, so thanks for sticking it out. My name is Alex Koeberle. I'm a PhD student at Cornell, and I'm advised by Surrey Safety and Lawrence Rudsum, and just like to acknowledge some other co-authors from DCC and folks from Cornell. And today I'll be sharing some of my research, which is evaluating Cisco restoration in Keuka Lake. So first, just a quick outline for my talk today. I'll provide some background information on Keuka Lake. Then I'll share some results from population modeling that we conducted, as well as some preliminary thoughts on food web modeling that we're in early stages of. And lastly, I'll conclude with future directions. But first, some motivation for this project. It's often believed that food webs populated with native species are better than food webs with non-native species. However, this idea is often untested. So in New York State, for example, on the left, these are Carriganine species, and many of you are familiar with Carriganines, but this species complex historically formed the native crayfish assemblage throughout the Great Lakes. But their populations have declined. Some species are extirpated, and several have actually become extinct. And this is likely due to a combination of overfishing, changing water quality over time, as well as competition from introduced or non-native species. And in New York State, as many of you are familiar, there's a suite of non-native invasive species. So I'd like to apply that idea to a case study of Keuka Lake, particularly where DEC has been conducting ongoing Cisco restoration efforts. And I'll pose these three research questions for my talk today. First, what is the viability of restoring a native Cisco population? Second, what has caused this documented non-native crayfish collapse that we've actually observed in Keuka Lake, and what are the implications of that? And lastly, what are sort of the broader food web consequences of this work? So, some background information. Keuka Lake is located in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. It's this distinctive Y-shaped lake with these three branches. And Keuka Lake is home to this wild lake trout population as the top predator. It's an entirely self-sustaining population. There's no stocking or augmentation. And historically, like in the Great Lakes, Cisco were the native forage fish. Their populations began to decline in the 70s and 80s until they were considered extirpated by the 90s, and we think that was likely due to predation on eggs from these non-native alewife and rainbow smelt, which had replaced Cisco as the main forage base. So just to go into this in a little more detail, this is historical catch data from New York State DEC. DEC has been conducting these lake-wide gill net surveys for lake trout going back to the 1970s, so we have a nice long-term data set where they sample the lake every 3 years throughout the lake. As you can see, this is Cisco catch, just the total number of Cisco caught per survey over time, and that the catch declined throughout the 70s and 80s, and they've since been considered extirpated. Since about the mid-90s, we haven't caught any Cisco in these statewide, or lake-wide gill netting assessments. This plot on the right I thought was just interesting. This is actually data from the early 70s that predates the standardized lake trout survey. This is just a frequency plot of total catch, and as you can see, Cisco were caught throughout the lake, so we have some idea of perhaps how they were distributed in the lake. So since then, we've seen these interesting dynamics with the non-native crayfish. So alewife catch is the plot on the left, rainbow smelt catch is the plot on the right. And in both cases, we see a slight increase in catch throughout the 90s after Cisco declined, but you see the trend is basically the same. The steep decline in both alewife and rainbow smelt catches after the early 2000s. This is the standardized lake trout survey, so there might be some selectivity, but since the 2000s, we've also conducted a couple forage netting assessments that were better targeted for forage fish. And while we've still caught alewife, generally we saw this crash in even the forage assessment, particularly for alewife, in about 2014 to 2015, which coincides with these cold polar vortex winters. So after 2015, we've really seen a crash in our alewife catches in the lake. So along with that, we've also seen this general trend of improved water quality in Keuka Lake. This is data provided by Keuka Lake Association, where residents have collected long-term water quality data going back to the early 90s. And this is Secchi depth. As you can see, there's a pretty tight linear relationship where Secchi depth has increased since the early 90s. And we also see decreases in nutrients, measured nutrients in the lake as well since the early 90s. And we think there's a couple factors that might be at play here, but zebra mussels arrived in 1994, and the Keuka mussels were observed in Keuka Lake in the mid-2000s. And there were some lake-wide improvements to how sewage and wastewater treatment was conducted in the 90s and early 2000s. So generally, despite this decline in prey fish, we see an increase in water quality. Now, you're probably asking, how has the lake trout population responded to this? So this is just lake trout catch using that standardized lake trout survey going back to the 1970s. And I've color-coded this as sort of the pre-alewife collapse phase in blue, and the orange is sort of post-alewife collapse in 2015. And you can see that there's been a general decline in lake trout catches since the early 2000s, when we saw that first decline in alewife as well as rainbow smelt. But sort of similar to catch, if it's an indicator of abundance, as what we observe in our catch data from the 70s and 80s. And if you just sort of separate out these years after 2000, we don't really see any sort of significant relationship with lake trout condition pre or post alewife collapse, despite this alewife void in the lake. So of course, the lake trout forms a popular fishery. DEC is very interested in conserving this fishery, and we want to promote resilience or stability to be able to manage this lake trout fishery. So that combination of the non-native crayfish collapse, improved water quality, led to Cisco being reintroduced by DEC starting in 2018. So to get to this first question, what's the population viability of this reintroduced Cisco population in the lake? To do this, we conducted an in situ demographic modeling exercise as well as a population viability analysis. And from the onset of this Cisco restoration, DEC had implemented this lake-wide, spatially extensive acoustic telemetry array. And we were also able to tag multiple cohorts of stocked Cisco. So since 2018, every year DEC has been stocking juvenile Cisco. And we were able to not only observe their movement and behavior after stocking, but also be able to estimate their survival rates. And this is important because juvenile fish are traditionally very difficult to estimate their survival. And particularly for Cisco, there have been a lot of questions about what's their survival after stocking and what's their contribution to, say, a wild population. So we were able to use these small acoustic transmitters coupled with this spatially extensive array to estimate their survival, and that's this plot on the left. So we conducted a multi-stage survival modeling analysis, and we were able to investigate factors like size, age at release, so both fall fingerlings and yearlings had been stocked. And this plot on the x-axis is time after stocking, on the y-axis is just the survival. These solid lines are the survival rates of fish that were stocked in the lake. And the yellow corresponds to fall fingerlings, the blue, older, larger yearling fish. These are fish that are held for the following year and released as yearlings. And what's very useful about this multi-stage approach is we can estimate not only annual survival, but we can actually partition stanzas of mortality throughout this survival trajectory, and then estimate the time periods when fish would transition from, say, this first stage after stocking, which is the steep mortality that you observe here, an acclimation period, and then this sort of longer-term period where you see these survival curves flatten out, which we assume is indicative of natural mortality. And we can do some simple math and actually extract that mortality rate of these stock fish and sort of back calculate what the annual survival rate would be of an age equivalent wild fish. So now we have hatchery stock, so hatchery origin survival rates, wild juvenile survival rates that are estimated from the survival curve, and we can plug that into a population model. So we used those juvenile survival rates as well as we conducted a catch curve analysis to estimate adult mortality from when we actually had catches of fish back in the 70s and 80s and conducted this population assessment. And what did we find? So we found that generally there's likely a low probability of success given these high mortality rates that we observe, particularly in those juvenile stages. And I'll unpack that in a little more detail. So these are outcomes from our population assessment. And what we did is we simulated population trajectories for 50 years, and we tested combinations of stocking rates, so both the stocking efforts of how many fish are stocked annually, how long they're stocked for, and then we posed some scenarios based off those survival rates of low, medium, and optimistic survival rates. These are outcomes from our sort of most optimistic scenario, where we were primarily stocking yearlings, which generally had better survival than fall fingerlings. And as you can see, this plot on the left, so we have time on the x-axis, and then we specified that a standing stock target of about 1,000 adults would be sort of a minimum viable population for the lake, as sort of an abundance or density target. And we were interested in seeing if any of these trajectories could meet that target and then persist. So these are individual simulated trajectories. This is just simply the median of those trajectories and confidence bands. And as you can see, it's pretty clear that even with 20 years of stocking under these optimistic conditions, once you cease stocking, although we hit this adult abundance target, that those population trajectories decline. And this plot on the right is just extinction probability. So if the densities decline, the extinction probability increases towards 100% over a long time horizon. So we concluded from this combination of telemetry and this population analysis that the future viability is likely low, given that high mortality we observed from stocking, as well as the high mortality rates that we specified for adult fish, which might be indicative of the current lake conditions, perhaps not being suitable for long-term viability of this population. So this analysis is very demographic focused. We tried to include some population dynamics that you'd observe. So these stochastic simulations, we included boom recruitment, which many of you may know. Carrigidines have this periodic recruitment that's cyclical. But this sort of fails to capture some of the more complex, broader ecosystem dynamics that might be affecting carrigidine restoration. So that leads to this work that I'm in early stages of conducting, so I'm not really going to share any results, but just like to discuss sort of where we're going with this work. And we've proposed using this food web modeling technique called linear inverse modeling to construct food web scenarios to be able to test sort of pre and post alewife collapse conditions, and then investigate future scenarios for Keuka Lake to sort of investigate, are there viable pathways for Cisco to be restored, or would we see a return to, say, an alewife-dominated lake? Inverse modeling, for those of you who are not familiar, in food web ecology, you often can't collect data on everything, but generally with these fish surveys, you can sort of come up with estimates of biomass, which you can then convert to, say, production. And you can also collect diets. So you have some information on the topology or structure of the food web, and then you can specify who eats who. The inverse part of this method is actually solving for the energy flows between different species. And that's what we're doing when we construct these food web models, is to be able to contrast the flow of energy between these different food web scenarios. So we can investigate, is a food web with alewife better or worse than a food web with Cisco? This is just a schematic diagram from this paper by Dick Van Koeberle, who developed this benthic marine food web, so just a conceptual food web diagram. And the inverse model, you're looking for combinations of flow values. So you essentially sample in a gray solution space that's constrained by your data to generate multiple food web scenarios, and then you can actually estimate that value, the probability of observing a flow value, and have a measure of uncertainty. So in Keuka Lake, we have a preliminary food web topology specified, so a relatively simple cold water food web, where we're really interested in looking at these trophic structures from alewife and Cisco prey fish and lake trout. And we thankfully have good long-term data sets from DEC, the Lake Association, where we can populate a food web using data from the lake from lower trophic levels, zooplankton, dry-sided mussels, as well as those long-term fish surveys for lake trout and crayfish. And just some preliminary data that I'd like to share. I think this is some interesting data that we've been looking at. This is just zooplankton densities from epigenetic samples conducted by Cisco Lake Association and Cornell going back to the early 2000s. And this is this 2015 alewife collapse, and you can generally see that after that 2015 collapse, we generally see an increase in the density of zooplankton in the lake. And then we also conducted this mysis survey in fall of 2023, which we think mysis are an important link in the food web. And what we found is that the mysis biomass in Keuka Lake is quite high. In fact, it's twice as high as the highest observed biomasses in recent years in Lake Ontario. So, yeah, I don't have any data, but just some hypotheses I'd like to conclude with. So for our food web modeling, what caused this alewife decline as well as their continued suppression in Keuka Lake? I hypothesize that really there's this top-down control of alewife, perhaps by this abundant wild lake trout population. And what are the ecosystem consequences of this? I've hypothesized that given what we know about the demography and current lake conditions, that top-down control by lake trout, as well as the lake conditions, might not be suitable for Cisco and Keuka Lake without additional management interventions. So with that, I'd just like to thank, this project has been a collaborative project with partners from DEC, USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the food web modeling is supported by New York Sea Grant. And thank you again, and happy to take any questions. Yes.
So